Today, we delve into an analysis of one of the most iconic and recognizable buildings of the modern era, being the Sydney Opera House, situated in Sydney, Australia, completed in the year 1973 and designed by architect Jan Utzon as part of an international design competition consisting of 233 design entries by architects from all around the world. The competition had two primary goals. First, being to be an architectural icon to represent the city of Sydney and the country of Australia to the entire world, and second, to fulfill the need for a cultural facility to accommodate the city's burgeoning performing art scene. The existing venues were inadequate for major performances and particularly for opera and large-scale orchestral works. Utson's innovative and daring design, featuring the now iconic sail-like shells, was chosen for its visionary approach and potential to become a global landmark, as the jurors saw the design fit to be one belonging to the building that would go on to become the icon of Australia. And they were right to put their faith in that belief, as it did go on to serve its purpose as the same. But in the process of designing a trophy building, Utsav went on to ignore the pedestal of the trophy, in this case being the podium of the building, the part of the building which he had the most control over, as with time the engineers took over the construction of the sails, leaving the podium almost characterless and missing out on the potential that it held to host exterior public spaces. Key fact that was overlooked was the fact that the opera house also doubled as a public building along whilst also being a cultural center. Here we see some views that one would see if one were to take a ferry ride from the quay into the Sydney harbour. And as we see buildings sporting colonnade, public plazas, and having a character to their ground floor, having public activities taking place, and as we pan towards the opera house, we are hit with a sense of muteness in terms of public activities.
As we move into the context plan of the Opera House, it sits on the main launch point, a 360 site with the Sydney Harbour to the north and the residence to the north-south well governor and the Royal Botanical Gardens. The ionization of the building is further upon as it becomes a building to look at, an achievement to admire, as one would see the iconic sail-like shells as they drift from the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The site became a point of convergence for the public coming in from the botanical gardens or after the ferry ride from the quay toward the main launch point.
As we analyze the floor plans, looking at the immediate context plan, we see that the building consists of the northern boardwalk, the western boardwalk, and lastly the eastern boardwalk, along with the opera bar and restaurant as shown. Further dissecting the point of the site, being the point of convergence for the public coming in from the quay and the botanical gardens, we see that the design does not carry the same principles, as the circulation of public is broken at the either ends of the eastern boardwalk, giving it the character of a back alley of a building where one rarely ventures into. Here we take a look at an excerpt from the competition brief, which states that the architect had the liberty to orient and place the building as they wished onto the site, and despite of this freedom being given to the architect, he went on to neglect the eastern boardwalk, breaking the 360-degree circulation that the Opera House as a public building could have benefited greatly from, bringing us to beg the question if that was a conscious decision made during the planning stages, and if so, why, or a mere afterthought.
Further elaborating on the public circulation patterns as seen in the roof plan, we would like to highlight two key features. First, being a physical barrier on the boardwalk from the botanical gardens, disrupting the flow of public, and second, being the fencing of the cleavage corridor placed in between two buildings, walking through which come onto the northern boardwalk, take in the view of Sydney Harbour and could have a great experience for the user, similar to the travelling to the tunnel to emerge onto the gush of light.
Furthermore, a diagrams which depict the flow of the ticket-bearing audience as they are dropped off at the roundabout and make their way towards the covered concourse, and that of the path of movement of service vehicles, which come along the boardwalk of the botanical gardens, conflicting with the movement patterns of the public on the same boardwalk or make their way towards the basement.
Zooming into the ground floor plan, where we see the movement patterns of the performers as they enter the building from the covered concourse and make their way through the service corridor to their respective venues. Here we like to highlight the movement patterns of the public to discuss the idea of possibility could have been had to the architect choose not to provide a solid wall at the end of the service corridor and allow the performer to spill out on the northern boardwalk and interact with the public. Taken a break from their rehearsal, maybe show a snippet from their previous work as the interaction of artists where we would like to show a few images of the street performers which take place across Sydney, showcasing the richness they bring in the term of public interactions and serve the purpose to not only pique the interest of the public in their art form. As we see across museums in the world today, a major part of the effort to make sure the legacy of the artist and the art is carried on, to educate the youth about those art forms, but also looking at in the form of lens of a young boy strolling around with his mother, being inspired to take up art as a profession, which bring us to reflect upon what Khan once said, and we quote, "A city should be a place where a little boy walking through its street can sense what he someday would like to be."
So looking at the internal planning of the spaces, we see that the prime real estate of the concert hall building, which gives scenic views of the harbor, is given to offices, bringing us to question choice of the placement of the set program in that location. And what if, instead of offices, there were rehearsal rooms there? And as the performers rehearsed, they took in the view of the harbor. As often it is known for artists to draw inspiration from nature, as the likes of Van Gogh took to paint his world renowned painting, The Starry Night, or Beethoven, whilst composing the Pastoral Symphony. Also, upon further analysis, we found that the space number 17, which are the production rooms, which also double as booking areas, are placed much far off from the public entrance, and pondered if it would have been better if we say the booking areas, if it would have been better if, say, if the double program of the booking offices was transferred over to number 14, the staff areas, which happen to be much closer to the entrance and also allow for the rooms to be used purely as production spaces, as they are placed much closer to the opera hall backstage.
It is also in this level that the access to the studio, play theatre and music theatre. The public enters from the entry here and make their way toward either of three venues, walking along the music theatre foyer, namely number 5, which become a closed off space due to the presence of solid wall on the western side, which would have provide a visual connection to the public within the views of the outside.
Here, we also see the movement of the service vehicles as they enter into the covered concourse from the eastern side and the personnel go into the building through the service corridor to carry the equipment for either the concert hall or the opera hall. Moving towards the first floor, here we see the monumental steps allowing the ticketed audience to enter into the box office foyer, and also the ones that came in through the covered concourse come up from one of the three staircases. They enter into the box office foyer, which is shared between the concert and the opera hall, from where they disperse towards one of the two main venues, the Benelong restaurant or the Utsan room. As we move northward in the plan, we see that there are spaces which are tucked in below the staircases accessing the main halls, which form a threshold and make the programs beyond that threshold as part of the back of the house. Going up to a podium level plan, we see the circulation of the ticketed audience as they make their way towards one of the two main venues. We would like to conclude our analysis of the Sydney Opera House by asking four primary questions. One, is it important for a cultural center to be in a modern day city? Two, if so, does it have to also serve as a public building? Three, does it have to be exclusive of the general public or inclusive of them? And four, lastly, what is the purpose of it in the city's urban fabric? Looking at the Sydney Opera House with respect to these questions, we believe that a cultural center is important in the city fabric as it carries the history of the city, nation and contributes in adding an identity to the nation, a similar role which was played by the Institute of Indology in our very own nation. It also plays an important role in continuing to conserve the cultural heritage of the musical art forms and passing it on to the next generation. We also believe a cultural center in the city should serve as a public building and be prioritized as one, especially when it was envisioned as an icon or a trophy building. In the case of the Sydney Opera House, characteristic we believe it lacks. And with that, we conclude our analysis of the Sydney Opera House. Through the critique, a question arose being what does it mean to be on the waterfront in Sydney? The experience of being by the water for the people, as the Opera House site sits on the waterfront, but the people visiting the icon do not experience the same due to the podium being a warehouse of venues and lacking a connection with the waterfront. Hence, my stand was to merge the two adjacent civic institutions, being the Royal Botanical Gardens and the Sydney Opera House, that sit on the same waterfront and allowing for the gardens to flow into the Opera House side, merging with the podium, allowing for the public to move through the gardens onto the northern boardwalk. The podium connects to one of the Royal Botanical Garden trails, allowing for the public to walk over a mount and then onto the Opera House podium. The move with it brings four key moments, being number one, the arrival to the Sydney Opera House, number two, the box office foyer access from the mounts, three, the central corridor present between the two shells, and lastly, the northern boardwalk mounts. Here we see the longitudinal section across the Opera House, highlighting the movement patterns of the people from the Botanical Gardens towards the northern boardwalk, encountering in between the box office foyer to descend down onto the first floor level, or continuing to go on towards the central spine and ultimately reaching the northern boardwalk in the end. Zooming in towards the arrival, there are two vehicular drop-offs. The first being for a bus for those using public transport, and second being a private vehicular drop-off at the base of the steps leading to the Mount Trail. The move is intentional to have the ticketed public wanting to access the box office foyer merge in with the public using the Mount Rail for a brief period whilst resuming their circulation to go to the lower floor and access the box office. A secondary access to the podium is present in the form of an elevator attached to the podium to access the first floor and the podium levels. Along with this, there's also a road that travels below the mounts through a tunnel leading to the service corridor for personnel to access the backstage of the venues. Panning over to the box office foyer access, the visiting public would be taken down from the upper level onto the first floor level, from which they can access one of the two main venues of the Opera House. We further pan towards the central corridor that sits between the two shells and allows for a visual connection to be made between the inside and the outside of the opera house for the public and the ticketed individuals. This also has two skylights that allow for light to enter into the lower floor, allowing for people working in the back of the house to have a sense of the time of the day. Lastly, moving towards the northern boardwalk mounts, we descend back down to the boardwalk level through the landscape steps. The mounts present on the northern boardwalk also have an opening for the people within the podium to step out onto the boardwalk as seen in this section. This move allows for the people working within the warehouse like podium to come out onto the boardwalk during their breaks for some fresh air, a cigarette break, or have a moment with oneself by sitting on the mounts, taking in the view of the harbor once they finish their shift.